This is Chris Morrow at Comic-Con at Home. I'm at the Tin Fish remotely, and the panel is The Wonderful, Horrible World of EC Comics. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, if you could introduce yourself and say where you are at home.
Sure. I am Danny Fingeroth. I'm the moderator of the panel. I was a writer and editor at Marvel Comics for many a year, and I'm the author of books including Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent, and this book, my biography of Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life, the amazing story of Stan Lee. It looks backward to me. Nice. I assume when it comes out it will be forwards, but anyway, this is the ultimate biography of Stan Lee, unauthorized, but interviews with him and his brother Larry and Roy Thomas and Denny O'Neil and a million other people, Al Jaffe, and there's also an audio book that I did for it. So if you're enjoying hearing this voice, then are you in for a treat with 14 hours of me doing the audio books? Anyway, Grant Geisman has done this wonderful history of EC Comics book for Taschen, and so he obviously is an expert on the history of EC Comics, which intersects at times with the history of Marvel and Stan Lee. But and I brought a couple of other authorities on things relating to EC and its friends and enemies. So that's who I am.
Here I am, Grant Geisman. I've written a number of books related to EC Comics, and the one we're sort of hanging the panel on is this new book. This is just a very flimsy copy of it, but it's called The History of EC Comics, and it'll be out in October from Taschen. And I'm very excited about it, and we kind of talk about it in the panel. And I just watched the panel. I thought it went very well. Thank you, Danny. Great job moderating, and everyone else I thought had nice things to say in the panel. So I was very happy with it. So thank you.
Well, thanks. And Travis, of course, did all the tech stuff. He made it look easy. Travis was he was player coach. He was on screen and working all the tech stuff behind the scenes.
Nicely done. Nicely done.
You edited it down from about 5.5 hours to 1 hour.
I'm Dr. Travis Langley, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Henderson State University, best known as author and editor of 13 books, starting with Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night, and most recently, The Joker Psychology, Evil Clowns and the Women Who Love Them.
And Ari Kaplan. Thank you, Travis.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Ari Kaplan. I'm a television comedy writer as well as a screenwriter for video games and transmedia. Over the years, I've written about 29 or 30 humor pieces for Mad Magazine. I also was a writer on the 2008 relaunch of the Tales from the Crypt comic book from Paper Cuts. And I wrote a book called From Krakow to Krypton, Jews and Comic Books, which is right here. And I interviewed Al Jaffe and some of the other folks from Mad Magazine and EC for that book. There's a huge section on EC in the book. And that about sums it up. Those are my EC bona fides, I guess.
The panel went very well, but it's just weird. You know, it's weird doing these Zoom things. In some ways, it's more intimate than being like in the 100th row back in a meeting room in a convention center. But it's just weird to like see everybody, you know, in their boxes and and sort of living through this very, this really EC type moment in history, except it's not in an EC comic. It's neither in Mad nor in, Tales from the Crypt, although it seems like it could be in either or both, but it's actual so-called real life. So this, I just find it fascinating and bizarre.
And while I missed the live audience, one nice thing in terms of panel interaction is that we get to look at each other, although often slightly off eye contact. But when we're doing panels up in front of an audience, we're lined up on a table, always looking outwards and maybe looking past each other.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I find myself when we do these things in person, I find myself definitely doing the thing of looking. I hope I'm not cutting Grant off or Travis off. No, I'm not. Okay, it's good for me I can talk now. But it is good because you do have this like live feedback loop with the audience, which you certainly don't have doing these we're like in the Phantom Zone or something over here,
Well, you don't have the weird audience, the weird and the good audience interaction. You don't have you know, I mean, that's live events and live entertainment. So it's
Yeah, we don't get the great audience questions. We don't get the weird ones. We don't get the audience members who seem to think they're part of the panel.
Oh yeah. And not that we're complaining, because without them, what will we do, right? They're not. Not like it's weird and potentially problematic that they're there in the first place, being way too obsessed with this subject matter. Yeah,
well, that's always the fine line, you know, when you.
it is.
Mhm.
But I,
Danny,
you know,
your volume-
I think the one nice thing about this is because it's virtual on the internet, this panel that we did, and even this discussion we're having now, is going to live forever. So people will be able to find this and look at it, good or bad, you know, good, bad, or indifferent. But you know, a lot of times you do these panels and they're gone. You know, you have the
Yeah,
memory of it, but it doesn't exist in any real form.
yeah.
Yeah, but that lets us do the same panel over and over.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you have to do better homework for the virtual ones.
Well, among ourselves, we all know Grant could do this whole panel by himself. We appreciate you letting us join you for company.
It's nice to have friends, right?
But next year when we do it, we're going to make you bring a guitar. And actually, you know, Grant has a secret identity.
Well, yeah, I'm a professional guitarist, and I also co-wrote the music to the sitcoms 2.5 Men and Mike and Molly, and I co-wrote the theme to 2.5 Men. So, and it's funny, years ago when I first met some of the Mad guys, they just thought I was this Mad collector guy. Like they had no idea I had this other, you know, professional life. It's like, oh yeah, that's the Mad guy. And then they found out, you know, I was a musician. It's like, wait, what? You know, it was quite funny.
So since the panels wasn't live, what kind of questions did you guys emulate or receive online that you haven't been able to answer?
We talked more than long enough ourselves on this topic without needing the questions.
That's right. We made up for it. We're not,
Well,
none of
Grant
us
has
are that shy, so it kind of worked out.
Yeah, well, you Grant, you have such this wonderful presentation on the history, and then the rest of us, we join here and there, with questions and comments. But and then of course we also the full length is okay, not quite the 5.5 hours Danny mentioned, but I will put the full length one online tomorrow on the Comic Con Fusion page on YouTube. We're allowed to 4 hours after the official one runs.
Would it be possible for you to talk about the history a little bit? It is a freshman year. Anybody can watch this, so just to see, to educate them on what's going on.
Maybe they'll watch us before they actually watch the panel because this is shorter.
Yeah.
Grant, what's EC Comics?
Grant, what's EC Comics?
Well, in a nutshell, EC Comics was a little company that published their most well-known work in the 50s, titles like Tales from the Crypt and Weird Science, and even a humor magazine called Mad. And they published the first true-to-life war comics, titles called Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. And they had some of the best artists and writers ever, and they're essentially considered some of the best comics ever published. So that can't be bad, right?
Grant, the EC, what does that stand for? And did it ever stand for something different and then come to stand for something other than that? Did it? What did
Originally, it stood for educational comics. The publisher of EC in the 50s of the comics that we just talked about, Tales from the Crypt, was a guy called Bill Gaines, William M. Gaines, but his father was MC Gaines, and he was involved in the very early comics industry, starting in the early 30s, even with giveaway comics. And MC Gaines recommended to his buddies at DC that they publish a little feature called Superman, and you might have heard of it. So he formed a company called All American, and he did some characters like Green Lantern and Wonder Woman and The Flash, characters that are still around today. And they had kind of a falling out, and the DC people bought him out of his share, and he started his own company called EC, which stood for Educational Comics, but also for Entertaining Comics. And he went along for a few years, publishing picture stories from the Bible and a line of kiddie comics, and he was tragically killed in a boating accident on Lake Placid in 1947. And his son, Bill, kind of was forced by his mother to take over the company. And little by little, they started making changes, and it kind of resulted in the things we talked about: Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, all these great horror comics and stuff. So that's it in a nutshell.
And I guess, and they were very, controversial, in the 50s when comics were incredibly popular. I mean, just sold millions and millions and millions every month to men, women, boys, girls, people, just everybody bought comics. There was no internet. There was barely television. So comics, especially the horror and the war comics that EC put out, were seen as very threatening by some psychiatrists and educators and clergy people. Comics were a secret communication channel that a kid could buy a comic for a dime, and there was no parental supervision needed. There was so it became kind of, especially thanks to this very complicated guy named Frederick Wortham and a lot of other people. Somehow comics were blamed for a lot of societies and especially teenage problems because it was this secret language and this secret medium. Not any adult could go in and buy them, but somehow it became thought of as these predatory publishers putting out stuff that would deform impressionable minds. So EC, was, just controversial, and it, a lot of stuff happened in the 50s in comics and in the culture in general, but there was a time when comics were not a niche medium and not just the source for multi-billion-dollar entertainment franchises, but they were something that people found delightful and threatening.
But another thing that I think needs to be said also is that the other end of that is, and I think this is so ironic because, like Danny was just saying, yes, they were thought of as this crude material, these stories that are making kids prone to juvenile delinquency and other things, causing them to embark on a life of crime. But what's ironic is that when you read the EC titles in particular, you see that they really were like the first progressive comics company in a lot of ways. And they were doing comics, literally stories about racism, about police brutality, about anti-Semitism, about these subjects that just no other comic book company was touching at all. And that, yeah, if you look at a lot of these Tales from the Crypt stories from a modern standpoint, they look a little quaint, and you can certainly see the twist endings coming a mile away. However, for comics written and illustrated in the 50s, the standard, the quality of the writing was quite good for its time. And again, these editors and writers and people like Harvey Kurtzman and Al Feldstein were just dealing with subject matter that no one else in comics was talking about. No one else in comics was talking about, would do a story about like corrupt white policemen chasing down and murdering young black men. And this is in the 1950s. And so I think that needs to be pointed out, that they were these morality tales, and a lot of them were very preachy to the point that where they were sometimes called, like, the umbrella name for them sometimes in-house was the Preachies, because they were these preachy morality tales, but they were really, the editors and writers and artists were really trying to do the right thing and trying to communicate these kind of these social justice messages. I think there's no other way to put it.
And even the horror comics, there would be a corpse coming out of the grave to exact vengeance on a cheating spouse or a conniving business partner. And so there's even kind of an eye for an eye, almost Old Testament morality, even to the horror comics. And a lot of those horror stories were taken out of context, so they would just isolate, the most horrific panel or series of panels, and it completely ignoring whatever morality might be, inherent in the story.
Yeah, but the other thing,
like Dr. Wortham, Travis, you can speak to this, but Wortham totally ignored any kind of context.
Right. Wortham looked at what he saw as the most gruesome or salacious elements. After World War II, there was this rise in juvenile delinquency. Over in England, they studied that rise in juvenile delinquency and attributed it to breakdown in some family dynamics that happened as a result of the war. Over in America, they wanted scapegoats other than themselves, and comics were the thing they latched onto before they got to latch onto rock and roll as the scapegoat to blame these things on.
Yeah.
And Dr. Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist, I as a psychologist have to point out, he was not a psychologist, he was a psychiatrist. Dr. Frederick Wortham had this 7-year campaign that culminated in his 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent, which sounds like a title that would have been created by people at EC Comics, and blaming juvenile delinquency on comic books. There's crime and horror comics, you know, the bloodiness over here, and he takes a whole lot of things out of context. He only actually had one chapter on superheroes and a couple other mentions of them. A lot of the attention from some people goes to what he said about Batman and Wonder Woman. But he attributed all these horrible things to the impact they would have on these children. And he would say things like, you know, I studied all these different children. He had no control group. He had a lot of scientific problems. We're even finding out lately that he faked some of his data. But even beyond that, he studies like all these juvenile delinquents I've studied. Every single one of them read comics. Well, it was the 1950s. They'd all watched baseball. Why not blame baseball?
They've all read the Bible.
Any of them drank milk.
They've all drank milk. Yeah. And the other thing, too, is that with all these comics, with Frederick Wortham and what he was saying about them and, you know, and what's being left out of the equation, too, is just that a lot of, and Al Feldstein has said this a lot in interviews where he was talking about what influenced him to create a lot of these EC titles, is that when he was in the service, when he was in the Army during World War II, he noticed that a lot of the soldiers were reading comics. It was like a reminder of their childhood, but they were starting to grow along with the audience was growing along with the comics. And so there was potentially an audience of older people reading the comics. And I think that they were really catering to that older group as well, especially when you consider that the main influences for the EC titles were not other comics. They were radio shows like Inner Sanctum and The Shadow, and pulp magazines like, again, The Shadow and Doc Savage. And so especially when you're talking about the pulps, you're talking about subject matter that was very lurid and very violent and often very sexual as well, very sexually explicit, especially for its time. And these are the sort of elements that Bill Gaines and Harvey Kurtzman and Al Feldstein were sort of trying to inject into these EC titles as well. I think they were going potentially for an older audience. I think they weren't trying to censor themselves. They were writing with, I suppose, themselves as the target audience, if you want to even say that they had a target audience. And so they were trying to reach older readers. I don't know how they could have like branded themselves differently to avoid the scrutiny of people like Wortham, but yeah, they inadvertently made themselves like,
People were attacking comics literally from the 19th century with the advent of comic strips in newspapers. I mean, that was nothing new. It was an easy target. You know, a lot of the comics came in with the daily newspaper that, you know, that every family member of whatever age saw. So they were always a convenient target. But I think the idea that comics were mostly or only for kids has always been, you know, it's a myth that never was really true. You know, especially during World War II and even the 50s, it was cheap, you know, portable entertainment.
Mhm.
You know, so but of course, a lot of kids did read them. You know, it's pictures and words, and so it was very colorful. So it became a convenient target, and not even necessarily EC, but once the horror comics and the crime comics became popular, then anybody, you know, who could who could type 2 words or could hold a pencil or pen jumped in, and there was stuff that was gratuitous and over the top, but EC certainly was the class act, you know, of all those publishers.
Yeah, the interesting thing about EC is most often the really horrific things sort of take place outside the panel, like they might show, a cover might show like a knife wielding maniac about ready to slice someone's throat, but he hasn't actually sliced the throat quite yet, you know. or
Yeah.
you know, they don't always show the most horrific things. A lot of times they leave it to the reader's imagination.
They really do, and that they're like when I was writing the stories for the 2000s relaunch of Tales from the Crypt, I used this one Tales from the Crypt story from the 50s as like the platonic ideal of like the perfect DC story, and it's the one where guy marries this woman, and it's been a while, so I'm gonna forget some of the details, but he buys these two little sugar figures to stand above the wedding cake, you know, of a husband and wife. But they're sort of like voodoo dolls. And when something happens to one of the figures, when something happens to the bride figure, then his real wife suffers the consequences. And same thing would happen if something would happen to the groom figure, right? So he like leaves the bride figure. He puts it, encases it in glass, and then the bride like suffocates. So he marries another woman. He uses the same sugar figures, right? Props them up in the closet so that nothing will happen to them. And then his new wife, his younger wife, is searching around, I think, in the kitchen or something, and accidentally knocks over the groom figure. And you hear this horrible scream come from off panel, and the groom figure has shattered into a billion pieces. And so obviously, this horrible murderous husband has also shattered into a billion pieces. You don't see it. You just see the groom figure laying in chunks, and you can only imagine how gory it would be if you actually saw what happened to the groom.
Right.
You know, Ari, it's only 65 years. He could have given a spoiler alert.
True.
Yeah, we might still want to read that story.
But and all this is communicated in only 8 pages. The economy of, I mean, and the consequence of that is that there's often overstuffed dialogue balloons and overstuffed narrative captions where they're just trying to squeeze as much text as possible in there, like almost comedically so.
But EC did have the comics where they're playing baseball with intestines and heads and.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, I didn't say they never did it. I said that many times they wouldn't show it. There was plenty of people getting sliced up and
you gotta tell
you know,
comics.
burned alive and all kinds of stuff. You know, let's not pretend that it didn't happen. But
I mean, it isn't to say, you know, when you say EC, everybody automatically flips to the horror or the violent crime. But it's also these incredible war stories that Kurtzman did in frontline combat that were really way ahead of their time as being anti-war stories, and beautifully done and incredibly written. You know, there's Mad Magazine. So, you know, there's the science fiction. So EC, you know, yes, the default thing that most people, including us, apparently think of as the horror stuff. But they did a wide range of stuff, and all really well done by top people whose names are still known. We didn't even mention Wally Wood, who crossed all those genres. You know,
right, yeah, they had some of the best artists. You know, Jack Davis, who later became, you know, for a while he was probably the most published advertising artist, you know, in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, I think. You know, even Frank Frazetta kind of came out of EC. You know, he kind of helped out his buddy Al Williamson on stories, and you know, there were Johnny Craig and just so many great artists. And you know, it's interesting because nothing at EC was overtly sexual, but these artists could really draw the female form, and you know, and they're still sexy today. You know, even for us to look at it. So, and I've heard from like first generation fans that bought this stuff off the stands, and you know, there was something going on there when you saw a beautiful figure, you know, illustrated by Wallace Wood, you know, or Bill Elder. They could draw women like nobody's business. And I've talked to people that were kids in the 50s, and they said, you know, wow, I mean, that is what a woman should look like. That's, you know, that's my goal. You know, this is telling me something.
Well, the other thing that I think needs to be said also is that how this stuff, like you were saying, Grant, about like what it was saying in terms of, you know, in terms of the readers thinking that this is what a woman should look like, this is what this should look. What's funny is that what Mad was doing at first anyway flew so far under the radar, and that's how they got away with what they were doing. Like, for example, when Dr. Wortham, you know, published his book, that automatically caused that there was the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, and you know, and Gaines was forced to cancel almost his entire line. Well, he was forced to cancel Haunt of Fear. He was forced to cancel Tales from the Crypt and Weird Science and a lot of those
And
types.
also his crime, you know, crime suspense stories.
Crime suspense stories, right? But he was not forced to cancel Mad, and I can only imagine that these senators must have looked at this thing. Oh, it's Mad. It's a humor title. It's probably the same thing as Archie and Friends or whatever, and they had no idea that ironically they were leaving the most subversive offering of EC. They were just leaving it completely alone, not touching it, because they thought, oh, it must be just a silly humor comic. In those days, humor comics were so watered down and so unthreatening, I guess you could say. And so I just find that incredibly ironic.
Well, Mad never had to go through the comics code.
Right.
The creator of Mad, it was interesting timing, fortuitous really, but the creator and editor of Mad, Harvey Kurtzman, he really wanted to turn Mad into a magazine, and he kind of pressured Gaines to let him do that. Mad never had to go through the code, and the common misnomer is that they changed Mad into a magazine to avoid the code, but really it had nothing to do with it. In fact, Gaines even said that he never would have thought of that. Like, it's a great idea, but that never would have occurred to me. So he changed it into a magazine to pacify Harvey Kurtzman, and then just by the luck of the draw and you know, serendipity, it became a magazine and never had to deal with the comics code.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Stay well, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.